Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. And today's record is not only one of my all-time favorite albums, but to me, it also represents just one of the greatest musical accomplishments in the history of mankind. Or actually, in this case, womankind, to be more precise. And that is the 1979 debut album by British punk icons, the Slits. Now, the Slits were formed in London, England in 1976 by drummer Paul Olive and singer Ari Up. After a couple early personnel changes, the band's lineup would be solidified with guitarist Viv Albertine and Tessa Pollitt on bass. Now, almost immediately, this band began separating themselves from a lot of their peers within the British punk rock scene, not only by being the only all-female band playing at the Roxy, but also through their incredibly unique attitude and style. The fact that they brought an array of different types of influences into their music. And slowly over time, the band began to build a reputation following of their own. The band got their first big break in 1977 when they were approached by Joe Strummer, who invited them to join the Clash on their 1977 White Riot tour with fellow Roxy staples, the Buzzcocks and Subway Sect. After a successful run with the Clash, the band returned back to London, and in 1978, the band made a brief appearance in the Don Letts film, A Punk Rock Movie. Now, towards the end of 1978, the band's drummer and founder, Paul Olive, left. There's always been two different sort of contrasting stories as to what actually happened. Paul Olive has always claimed that she left the band of her own free will, whereas Viv Albertine and Tessa Pollitt have always maintained that she was fired. Now, regardless of how all of this went down, Paul Olive soon joined the Raincoats, and in 1979, the remaining members of the Slits signed with Island Records, and in September of that year, they released their 1979 iconic debut album, Cut. Now, this album is produced by Dennis Bovell, and really this thing kind of defies categorization. To use the vernacular of today, I would say that this album is genre non-conforming. It's got a dose of punk rock, it's got a splash of reggae, it's got Afro pop, it's got post-punk, it's got new wave. And when all of these ingredients are blended together, this thing is mixed into a potpourri of punk rock perfection. Now, I remember my first impression of this album I think I was 18 or 19 years old the first time I ever heard this album. And my first impression of it was based on the sleeve, which I found to be very titillating. And it definitely aroused my curiosity. Actually, now, when I look at the album cover, what it reminds me of now, I don't know if you've ever been to the Oregon Country Fair or not, but this is basically what the Oregon Country Fair looks like. It's a lot of scantily clad young kind of hippie girls roaming in the Oregon countryside. The first time I actually went to the Oregon Country Fair, this was the first thing I thought of was this album cover, because this is kind of what it looks like. But upon my first listening to this record, I was probably 18 or 19 years old the first time I listened to this album. And like I said, it was probably through the recommendation of a friend of mine. And I remember the first time I listened to this album, as it was playing, I was just sort of like, I mean, I could kind of recognize that what was going on was brilliant, but I'm not kidding you. It was just, this thing just went right over my head. So after a couple listens, I made the executive decision that I was just going to put this thing away for a while and maybe revisit it sometime down the road. I would say I finally did revisit this record maybe 5 or 6 years later. And by this time, I think that my palate had been more developed. Perhaps I was a little bit more mature. Not so mature that I wasn't still puking in bushes when the opportunity presented itself. But I remember I went out and I bought this CD just on a whim because I remember that I had heard it. And supposedly it was this great, iconic reggae punk rock masterpiece. And I took it home and listened to it, and it finally just really stuck to me. And now, I'd say over the past 20 years, this has been one of my favorite albums of all time, bar none, regardless of genre, regardless of era. I mean, this has always been, probably the last 20 years or so, has always been one of my favorite albums. Side 1 kicks off with the song Instant Hit. That is a killer. The song So Tough is awesome. The album Spend is amazing. Shoplifting, of course, is one of the most iconic songs by the Slits. Awesome! The next song, FM, which ends side 1, is... I hate saying anything like this because this record is so brilliant, but this is probably my least favorite song off this record. Sorry. I don't like saying that. I love this album. But I'd say that FM is probably the weakest song on this record. Side 2 gets going right away with Newtown, which I absolutely love that song. Ping Pong Affair is amazing. My second, probably least favorite song on this album is Love and Romance. Again, it's not bad. I think it's better than the song FM. But if I had to pick a second least favorite song off this record, it would probably be Love and Romance. And then the next song is probably the biggest song the band ever had. And I really don't give a good goddamn. The saying is the goods. And that is the song Typical Girls. I love that song. After that, Adventures Close to Home is amazing. And I think actually one of the best songs on this record is the last song on side 2, which is their cover version of the song I Heard It Through the Grapevine. And one thing I love when bands decide to do covers is when they take the song and they make it their own. And the Slits absolutely murder the song I Heard It Through the Grapevine. One of my favorite songs on this record, which closes it out. Again, this is one of my all-time favorite records, bar none. Genre and era notwithstanding. Anyway, in 1980, despite the fact that this album achieved, I think, respectable commercial success, I believe it reached the top 30 on the British pop charts, the band was abruptly dropped by Island Records. And according to testimonials by the band, almost without explanation, this sent the band reeling. They were devastated. They were confused. They weren't sure what they were going to do next. The band had always felt that they had found the perfect professional home with Island Records. And after a little bit of soul searching and maybe being courted by a few other record labels, in 1981, the band signed with CBS Records. And in October of that year, they released their sophomore album, Return of the Giant Slits. And nobody noticed. Because what had happened between 1979 and 1981 was that the musical climate, at least in Britain, had completely changed. I mean, punk rock was sitting in a drawer at the county coroner's office. It was dead. And the public had just become bored and lost interest. And this album was basically released into the abyss. Nobody could have possibly cared less. I actually really like this record a lot. Soon after its release, because it did so poorly. I mean, you couldn't even really say that this album flopped. I think even that is an overstatement. I think this thing just went out the window and never came back. Soon after this, the album went out of print. But I actually really like this album a lot. This album is nowhere near as good as Cut, in my opinion. But this album is even, I would say this album is even more genre bending. It's got more reggae. It's got more Afro pop. It's got more club influence, even some early hip hop influence, punk, of course, post-punk. But I really love this album. The recipe that they had on Cut works on this record, but just not quite as good. I think that everything on this record is just kind of a slightly B-rated version of what was on Cut. But it starts off side one with the song Earthbeat, which is awesome. I really love that song a lot. Or What It Is great. Face Place is okay. It's definitely not my favorite song on the record. Walkabout is awesome. This album was also produced by Dennis Bavell. I don't know if I mentioned that yet. Difficult Fun is a really awesome song. Animal Space is okay. I love the song Improperly Dressed. Oh my, holy smokes, that's a cut right there. And this album ends with the song Life on Earth. I really love that song a lot. Like I mentioned, right after this record was released, it essentially went out of print almost immediately, and the band was immediately dropped by CBS Records in 1982. And at that point in time, instead of regrouping and trying to start the whole process over again, the band just completely broke up. And I would say beginning in kind of like the mid 1980s, the band began to sort of slowly develop this almost sort of like cult status. And then in the early 1990s, during the kind of the alternative revolution, when artists like Kurt Cobain and some of his contemporaries began talking about the Slits and how much of huge fans they were and how much of an influence the band had on those bands, there started to develop a lot of urban legend and a lot of folklore around the band. And eventually, at some point, the band almost took on like a mythical status. And at some point, a lot of people were starting to wonder, have we actually heard the end of this quirky little avant-garde punk band from London? And in 2005, that question was answered when the band reformed with singer Ari Up and bassist Tessa Pollitt. Now, according to Tessa Pollitt, the band did ask Viv Albertine if she would be interested in joining the reformed version of the band. She declined, and so with Ari Up and Tessa Pollitt and sort of a revolving cast of characters, the Slits started playing out shows again in 2005, doing some festivals and small tours. And in 2006, the band released their first new music in 25 years in the form of an EP called Revenge of the Killer Slits. Now, I don't own this record on any sort of physical format. It is streaming if you'd like to listen to it that way, but this album has 3 songs on it, which I actually think is pretty decent. It sounds kind of like a modernized version of the Slits. They don't quite capture the original sound or energy of the band, but I actually think that the Revenge of the Killer Slits EP is pretty good. It has a song called Slits Tradition, which I really like a lot. The second song is called Number One Enemy. I think that's the best song on the EP, personally. And then the third song is Kill 'Em With Love, which is pretty good. I don't think there's really a clunker on the whole EP. I mean, it's not life-changing, maybe on the level of something like this. But I thought it was cool. I think it's an adequate return from 25 years of hibernation. So after that EP was released, the band continued to tour and play festivals. And in 2008, singer Ari Up was diagnosed with breast cancer, which apparently, according to things I've read, she actually kept from her bandmates throughout most of her struggle. In 2009, the band released their final album. This album was called Trapped Animal. And I did listen to it again. I don't have this one on physical copy. I did listen to it when it first came out. And to me, it just wasn't really my thing. I would actually like to go back and revisit it at some point in time just to re-listen to it again. I think I listened to it maybe twice when it first came out. To me, it was just like a little bit too modern sounding. It was a little too clubby. And I'm not necessarily criticizing that. It just wasn't what I was really looking for. After the release of the 2009 album, the band continued touring and playing shows until after a particularly rough tour cycle and a lot of really negative interpersonal strife within the band. The band finally broke up permanently in 2010. in early 2010, I should say. And towards the end of 2010, unfortunately, lead singer Ari Up passes away after 2 years battling breast cancer. Now, I don't know if this is actually... I heard the rumor. I don't know if it's actually true or not, but I heard that this was a rumor I heard, that when she was first diagnosed with breast cancer in 2008, singer Ari Up actually declined traditional chemotherapy in fear of losing her Rasta dreads. Now, like I said, that may be a rumor. I've never heard any of the band members sort of substantiate that. But living down here in Nashville, all the hayseeds that live down here would refer to that as dying with your boots on. Anyway, thanks for checking out this video. Remember to support your local record store. Go out and listen to the Slits. I mean, what else have you got to do? Actually, listen to this one, because this one is already so championed. Go out and check out Return of the Killer Slits. Return of the Giant Slits. Sorry. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video. Support your local record store. And I'll talk to you next time.